bright light erupted in the dark night sky, followed by a silent, glittering explosion of white stars. Simon blinked in surprise, almost losing control of his car. Another flash sparkled, followed by another, creating an ocean of illumination. Simon hesitated, acknowledging his speed, and slowed to a safer speed. He had been enjoying his journey each night back from the hospital, having visited his wife Mary to the point of almost being thrown out for staying too long, but he didn't mind waiting for the birth of his first child. Each night, he travelled the 50-mile stretch home through the darkened country lanes in the Scottish Highlands. He had made the journey so often the car almost knew the roads by itself. 60 or 70 miles per hour he would drive, almost as if he were instinctively a part of the highways, the surrounding land. Tonight was different, with the occasional spectacular flash in the distance. The only thing that differed from a firework display was that everything here was pure white. Whatever it was, he hoped he might see better soon. It was occurring in the direction he was heading. The sky above, dark and so empty, made him feel lonely. It was the same each night, as if he were swimming in a sea of emptiness, as if the world didn't even know or care that he existed. When he was with Mary, all feelings of being alone vanished. He was whole again. Someone loved him without question. Soon there would be another, perhaps a daughter, perhaps a son. He didn't mind, just as long as he was loved. The winding roads would each night become an analogy for his life, forcing him to reflect on his accomplishments and failures. With the optimism and excitement of the impending birth, so came feelings of disquiet as he drove. Something felt different tonight, a greater sense of loss, as if each mile he drove was a step further away from a life of love and belonging. No matter what, however, he tried to shift his thoughts. Still, he could not help but feel ill at ease. Another starburst broke his tranquility, and once again he focused on the road, his eyes on the brilliant white lights. As he drew nearer, the flashes faded, but the sky continued to change, first from its deep liquid darkness to a maroon colour awash over the sky, then crimson pastels. He could imagine this being fine on an early summer's night, but not now, well past midnight in the fall. Something felt offbeat, as if the world had tilted and he hadn't gone with it. Feelings of unease squirmed within him, reckless memories of his past mixed in with whispers of his thoughts about what lay ahead. No matter, he would have to continue. One problem of having moved to Scotland was few friends and no family nearby to stay with. As his mind churned over recent events, his speed increased again, this time intentionally. As he rounded the corner, each one sharper than the last, he enjoyed the thrill of the open night and the exhilaration of the car's speed. Fleeting thoughts of his family affected little by his desire. On a long straight stretch, he floored the accelerator just as he approached the heart of the sky's most brilliant illumination. Surrounded by a sea of darkness, the place he approached lit up like a neon light show. Suddenly his car spluttered. Everything lurched forward as the car shuddered, accelerated, spluttered, dying on him, and jerked insanely. As he nudged heavily on the accelerator, the car misfired once, then went dead. The engine fell absurdly silent, followed instantly by his lights dying like an ember immersed in water. Simon sat for a moment, stunned by the odd behaviour of his car. It had never occurred to him before to imagine what it might be like, being stuck in the middle of nowhere in Scotland, close to midnight. For the first time, he knew just how dark the country was, how reliant he'd become on his car, and far from anywhere he really was. As he had driven on previous nights, his car headlights had shone so brightly the land lit up, came alive. Now he sat, trying to see anything outside. It was simply too dark. He tried turning the key, not even a click in response. The car remained much like its surroundings outside, dead. Finally, after cursing his luck several times, he opened his door and stepped out. As soon as he did, he felt an urge to sit inside again. Mary had always nagged him to get a mobile telephone. Even she had one, but he feared the radiation in the same way he feared soft-boiled eggs and beef. He cleared his eyes, blinked once or twice and stared around, but it was so dark he couldn't even see his hand in front of his face. Something made a rustling sound close by and he jumped, now unusually nervous. Another sound made the hair on the nape of his neck crawl. He could have sworn it was a whisper, something so close but unfelt. It had sounded like one word, but he could barely discern what it was. "Who's there?" he called out, at first sounding timid, then louder. "Is there someone there?" Silence met his questions, and darkness. Slowly, as he waited, his eyes adjusted to the void, and he could make out a shadow of nearby tall trees. At least he hoped they were trees. The lights he had seen as he drove in the sky had sunk lower, now hovering like a fine mist above the hilltop. The bright white had given way to a deep crusty red, shimmering as he stared at it. He pondered its beauty, fascinated by how it cloaked the hillside. As he marvelled at its spectacle, he never considered why it offered no illumination to his path or surroundings. Finally, he decided it would do him no good waiting. He was tired and needed help to get home. He began walking, carefully ensuring his feet remained on solid tarmac, the click of his heels enough to see him through. Black eyes stared out into the shadowed fields, watching for signs of movement. The cloaked figure sat patiently, hands clasped, thoughtful. Occasionally, a bat would fly near, and the hidden figure would eye it until it moved away. In such a forgotten part of the world, few would be out so late in the midnight country. But tonight would be different. It already had been, and now such was the expectation of the clan. Now their dreams and ambitions would be fulfilled finally. "Any signs?" a voice whispered behind the darkened stranger. "Nothing much yet." Both felt the same disappointment. "Shh," another insisted. Even in the night, they could feel the man's stare, understanding without question it wasn't a request. Again, the darkened stranger fell silent, watchful, waiting in the void. Simon tripped on something underfoot and cursed. "Trust me to break down in the middle of nowhere and when there's no moon," he muttered to himself. Though the sky was clear of cloud, no stars were obvious, and light from anywhere appeared rare, if at all. Still, he headed down the road, aware that with each step he grew closer to the paint-box sky, now a misty red haze, like a faint but apparent inferno. Again something hidden in the fields near the road cracked, like a twig breaking. He felt a chill run down his neck, uncertain whether it was the frosty night air creating his tension, or an instinctive awareness someone was following him. Rarely one to dwell on negative thoughts, he pulled his jacket collar up and walked on. His mind wandered as he walked, to thoughts of his future, his wife, and the child they might expect any day. He could not help but hope for a girl, but knew his wife didn't mind, so he agreed that was best. Life had its difficulties, but at least he had what he had long wanted, someone to love him unconditionally, unselfishly, and a family of his own. A plain, high-pitched voice called out, "Help!" interrupting his thoughts. He stood and listened, waiting to see if it occurred again, to confirm it really had been a voice. Having grown up in a big city, he had become accustomed to hearing minor cries for help, and all too often finding out to his embarrassment it was simply someone fooling around. "Help!" a faint voice came again. Simon shifted his head, trying to find its direction. "Help me!" the voice came again. It was unusually high-pitched, but he couldn't be sure if it were a man or a woman. Experience had taught him caution, but being a decent person, he could never leave someone in distress. He was at a crossroads, a quandary of conscience. Should he ignore the pleas, be mindful of his imminent family, or should he answer the call and perhaps put himself at risk? He could see an empty road heading downhill, no tension, no problems, but perhaps a life of looking back, wondering, and out in the fields he could hear a voice sounding increasingly alarmed, afraid even, presenting risk, uncertainty, but at least a clear conscience. Deep down, he had already accepted his fate and felt able to deal with whatever should happen to him. Turning and looking up into the pitch-black hills, he took a deep breath and decided to offer help. Movement out in the fields became more intense. Shadows of things real and unreal danced about. Though Simon remained unaware of this hidden spectacle, a sideshow had begun. Excitement filled the air. He was coming. More cloaked figures shifted around, moving quietly but effectively around the black hills, watching him as he made his way closer. Soon they would see terror and dance at the melee. The ground beneath Simon's feet gave way a little, and water replaced it as he trudged along a marshy field. He wanted to curse himself for having even started it. The voice had fallen silent, and he felt ready to turn and go again. As he did so, the voice called louder than ever. He was getting closer, though a voice in his mind warned him maybe the voice was getting closer to him. The land around was splashed in a crimson wash, red grass and trees. Such was the vibrancy of the sky. By its dull light he could make out enough to avoid falling over a stump or slipping into a nearby stream. He pulled himself up a steep incline and waited a moment, breathlessly. More voices became apparent, and he ducked down, fearful of being seen. There was a commotion some yards away. It was hidden behind bushes and trees, and Simon knew there were many people gathered. Lowering himself, He crept along the ridge of hedges, watching wide-eyed around himself, each step deserving of his attention. He had so much to lose. He felt crazy, in the middle of a field in the Scottish Highlands, sneaking up on a group of unknown strangers after breaking down for the first time in his life. He often wondered if life had conspired against him, such was his misfortune. Though others had tried to press upon him how life affected everyone with its difficulties, he couldn't fail to note how few others ended up with quite the same odd luck. Something flashed past him in the dark. He fell to his knees, heart thumping against his chest. He jerked around, trying to see what it had been, but the thing had gone. He struggled to hold his breath, fearful of giving his position away. He now felt both foolish and, for the first time, afraid. Voices in his head screamed at him to run, to get away while he could. But something deeper told him he had no choice but to go on. He sat up again and could see people gathered around a fire. It appeared to be some kind of religious sect. Whatever they were up to, he had no interest in. He remained only to help anyone in distress. If only he had gotten a mobile phone, he reprimanded himself once again. One of the clan rose, facing the sky, and roared in delight. The others surrounding the man followed, calling out, wailing some kind of celebration. Simon half expected them to shed their robes and begin an odd ritualistic dance, but the scene was far too serious for that. This became more obvious once he cast his eyes on a struggling figure on a wooden table. It was too far to make out if they were male or female, and behind the flickering flames, the vision appeared distorted. The figure who had led the chorus cast his arms around, sweeping those before him as if to order them silent. Instead, each fell to their knees, staring up at him, continuing to call out something bizarre. Quite how he should react or what he should do, Simon had no idea. But the nagging at the back of his mind told him to do something, anything. He had never been a particularly courageous person, but now he felt he had an instinctive desire to do what was necessary. He felt it instinctively right that he was there for this. Without another thought, he began edging away from his hiding place. Ensuring no one was looking, he scrambled across the open space in the darkness of a tree enclosure. He waited, more out of breath from fear than his exertions. His heart and mind raced as he stared at their exhortations, a willing spectator to the circus show. The crowd began whispering so low as to be indiscernible, until a lone shrill voice rose above the rest. Simon raised his hands, expecting for the sound to become unbearable, but the pitch changed more melodious, sonorous. His deep unease abated, and he felt himself genuinely relaxing. What appeared to be a group of followers started to sway back and forth in time with the girl's vibrant chants. She stood tall above the others, who were as one kneeled before her. She found herself intertwined with her melody. He found himself intertwined with her melody, and thoughts of fear and danger dissipated. Suddenly it changed, as she swung around and faced directly towards him. She continued singing, very subtly, almost below her breath, but still he could hear her. The group continued to sway, only now their attention turned to him. His heart once again beat with fear, panic striking him. Should he up and run? Could he stay and hide, hoping she wasn't truly looking at him? Instinct told him the truth, but a mortal fear held him like a rabbit in headlights. The girl began walking over to where he hid, still singing gently, swaying as she walked over. To an outsider, the scene before them might appear like a play, but to Simon it all felt natural, somehow right. He fell backwards a little, realizing he would be seeing clearly now, but he would have it out and no matter what happens, suffer the consequences. As she came within a few feet of him, now humming quietly, he stood and stared back, intent on a confrontation. The flames of the fire behind the girl had risen up, but still he felt more than saw something in the image of the figure on the table. "What are you doing here?" he said, trying to hide his fear. The girl fell silent now, but stood staring as if she were struck dumb by his demeanour. "Who is that laying beyond the fire?" The girl smiled, although it was difficult to see, darkness shrouding her features. She half held out her hand, and Simon reacted fitfully by pulling away. Almost as one, the crowd behind stood and began moving towards him. He feared that now they would react, and stepped away from the girl. Intent on seeing what had been going on closer, and perhaps snatching the victim away, he circled away from the closing group and rounded towards the still figure. Some of the group, unable to contain themselves, burst into laughter, almost celebration. Others started chanting again, some singing. Simon felt bewildered by the commotion, surprised at their lack of interest in his actions. As he hurried around the fire closer to the apparent victim, Simon noticed another person stood deeply cloaked in shadows. Something emanated from him. Nothing that could be seen, just felt, some kind of aura. The man in the dark wore a long covering robe, a hood covering his features. Deep down, Simon felt thankful for that. Simon waited a moment, watching the silent man, ready for some kind of reaction. None came until he attempted to move closer to the clearly unmoving body on the table. As he moved nearer to the body, so the stranger moved towards him. When he stopped moving, so did the stranger. "What is all this madness?" Simon asked the stranger, unsurprised when no response came. "You're crazy!" he shouted, hastening to the body. The stranger kept coming, but undeterred, Simon grabbed at the cloth covering the body. He pulled it away in anger, trying to contain his fear, to prepare himself for whatever he might see. Images flashed into his mind, of his journey that night, of the things he had seen, and other things he could almost remember, but not where from. Stark horror struck him as he focused first on the large pointed dagger protruding from the body, blood oozing from its wound, then his mind reeling as his attention turned to the face of the man, the body. The victim was him. He was looking down at himself, dead. He felt faint, his mind a barrage of confusion. The stranger now stood beside him, watching as he stared slack-jawed in horror. The man before him grinned, waiting for his reaction to broaden as if he were enjoying it. His oily skin reflected in the fire, with his black sodden hair and stubbled chin. He could have been any other man on the street, except for his eyes, two black pits, devoid of life or soul. Simon struggled for words, nowhere to turn to, unable to deal with the nightmare unfolding around him. As he leaned a hand for support on the table beneath his body, he could see the truth. His hand was clear, barely real. He looked himself up and down, and knew at last that indeed he was dead, stood before his long-sacrificed form at the mercy of those before him. The stranger staring at him began laughing as the sinful congregation gathered around them to chant and offer their black prayers. "Welcome to hell," the stranger shouted, and the others whispered his words. Simon fell in ethereal form to his knees, weeping invisible tears, thinking of his wife, the woman he had always loved, and tears for the child he would never see. The fire blazed, opening like a doorway, beckoning him. A face formed in the flames, enviously wanting him, ready to offer thanks for their sacrifice. "I love you, baby," Simon whispered, thinking now only of them. It was all as it should be, an ultimate act of evil, a sacrificial lamb for the slaughter. The eerie scene shattered like a broken mirror as somewhere a voice shouted out, in pain, screaming, then rejoicing in the agony of childbirth. As the scream pitched, Simon felt light, relieved. The deep-seated fear lifted as he felt himself shift away from the pyre, towards something far greater than the evil that had taken his life. As his wife screamed in pain and pleasure, giving birth to his son, so he disappeared, his soul reborn in a moment of pure love, memories washed away, and he was saved. The gathering of tormentors screamed, rising up as their sacrifice slipped away. The stranger began calling, chanting, offering black prayers and ritualistic summonings, but none worked. The flickering face in the fire shifted, growing impatient, angry. Suddenly fire leapt out, taking hold of them one at a time, each screaming in agony, pain and fear as they were taken into the pit. The stranger tried to appease the apparition, but it would not heed his calls, licking and spitting out tendrils of fire, wrapping itself onto those that would mock it. An outrageous dance ensued with flailing, terrified worshippers struggling to be free. Now the stranger knew what fear was, as the hidden took him. A riotous mass of fire entwined with bodies, whirled around in an evil panorama, folding down into the ground, dying back into the earth. Somewhere, a baby cried, and its mother comforted it. Somewhere a mother held her baby and cried, "I love you too."